Welcome, everyone. It's a delight to be here with you this evening, not least of all because it's the launch of our new online series, Mindfulness is for Everyone, that will host free events and workshops like this over the coming years. It'll be fairly spaced out. It's also the launch of our new Café Contemplative. So in that spirit, we hope that you maybe have a warm beverage nearby. I would invite you to maybe have a notebook or some paper and a pen, so you can jot down some reflections this evening that I'll invite you into. As all of that is happening, oh, and by the way, also in the chat, it would be great if you could let us know where you're zooming in from, so we have a sense of sort of the scope and scale of our virtual cafe this evening. And as all of that's happening, I would like to say thanks to a few organizations and people. First of all, to the Spirituality Mind Body Institute and Naropa University for supporting and funding this series, Mindfulness is for Everyone series. I'd also like to thank Extended Campus for hosting it, especially Jacob Goldberg and Liz Pope for all their support. And finally, and most importantly, I'd like to thank my grant team and collaborators on the series, Charlotta Rotterdam, Carla Burns, and Clarissa Segrand. I'm Jordan Quaglia. I'm an associate professor of psychology and research director in our Center for the Advancement of Contemplative Education here at Naropa. And you likely encountered my bio while you were registering for the talk, so I won't say too much, but my background is really dual or hybrid, as both a contemplative educator and practitioner on one hand. For example, I'm part of the teaching team for our upcoming Welcome Compassion Training program that starts next Tuesday. So I hope you'll join us for that. And I believe Liz is going to put a code in the chat for that. So that's one part of my background. On the other hand, I'm also a researcher and scientist who studies contemplative practices and who studies contemplative states of mind. So it's really that sort of dual approach or hybrid approach that I'm going to try and bring to this question, the central question of my talk this evening, which is about what a contemplative practice is. What does that mean? And what isn't a contemplative practice as well, I think equally as important. So let me go ahead and pull up my slides. We'll take a look at the outline where we're headed this evening. We'll do a little contemplative practice together. It's totally optional. And then we'll get started into the heart of the talk. All right. One other thing I'll mention is that this hybrid approach, really, my goal is to support you all in personal reflection this evening. And my hope is that you'll not only be able to, by the end of this talk, answer this question for yourself, what is and isn't a contemplative practice, but that it will actually invite you to sort of rethink and maybe refine or further reflect on your own set of contemplative practices, or maybe you're just getting started out on your journey with contemplative practices. And I hope that there's enough here for beginners too. You might even find that some of the things that you're doing that you don't think are currently contemplative practices could be a contemplative practice already, or you can lean into them in certain ways to further cultivate them as contemplative practices. So let's take a look at the outline here. All right, so basically we're going to talk about the central problem, that there's little agreement about what exactly a contemplative practice is and the boundary conditions of a contemplative practice. But rather than just thinking about that as sort of intellectual exercise, we're going to talk about why I think this matters for the mindfulness movement and for the contemplative movement more broadly. And then we're going to talk about existing sort of solutions or approaches to this question of what a contemplative practice is. And I've got 4 listed there. And these are the 4. There's many approaches that are taken. And my approach that I'll present later this evening is just one of many, even in our community at Naropa, to answering this question. But these 4 here have been really central to my thinking about what a contemplative practice is. And so we'll see that I think there's a gem in each of these approaches. And we'll talk about that. And all of that will inform what I share later on, is this new approach to thinking about what a contemplative practice is. I'm sharing it tonight for the very first time. And part of that is going to be personally exploring this for yourself. And by the end of tonight, I'm also going to be sharing a new free resource that will be available for you to download for free, that you can begin using yourself, and you can begin sharing or perhaps bringing to others, maybe in your organization or in your clinical work, or whatever setting you would like to bring that. So that's going to happen at the end of the talk tonight. And then finally, I think we'll have time for some Q&A. All right. Now that we've done that, why don't we further welcome ourselves and each other into this space with a brief contemplative practice. This is one of the simplest contemplative practices that I can imagine. It's only going to last a couple of minutes or so. And in fact, the first part of it, one of the reasons I asked you to maybe have something nearby to write some notes down is partly for this contemplative practice. So the first step of this contemplative practice is going to involve thinking a little bit and maybe making some notes for yourself. As always, this is totally optional. If you're not feeling that this is supportive for you, no worries. You can just hang out for a couple minutes and we'll get into the talk soon. So the first step of this practice that I call your present spark, it's a present spark practice, is going to be to identify something or someone, or maybe it's a gesture or a symbol. I'll give some more examples in a moment, that when you bring it to mind, you sort of immediately feel more present and more centered in this moment as you think about it. So is there something like that that you can think of? Or it could be, for example, I have a friend who likes to put their hand on their belly. That helps them feel more centered and present, or their hand on their heart. Or it could be a specific being. Sometimes I get the image of a cat basking in the sun on a windowsill. That invites presence, maybe a landscape or a word. So I'll go quiet now. Go ahead and make this personal, something that helps you feel more present and more centered. And hopefully you've identified at least one thing at this point. And the next part of this practice is also quite simple, and that's to hold this thing in mind. Bring it to mind and sort of hold it in mind. I like to think of this as a kind of inner resource. And see if you can't let yourself connect with this inner resource and feel the support of its qualities, inviting you into this moment. Remembering to breathe. It can help you circulate the energy. And as the final step of this practice, if you were doing this in a more formal way, maybe for a longer stretch of time, if your mind wanders to something else, just gently invite it back to attuning to this inner resource. Okay, thank you. Thanks for trying that out. If you resonate with this, if you found value in this approach, I'll mention that you can kind of add it to any contemplative practice. It can be something that you do at the outset of, for example, sitting meditation, just kind of land and come into the moment and find that unique thing or set of things that really helps you connect and feel grounded and centered when you bring it to mind. So if you didn't find that thing in this session, no worries. I invite you to keep exploring what a possible present spark might be for you. Now, it's a good thing that we did a little practice together, not only to welcome ourselves into this space, but because we're now going to talk about this central problem. And in order to do that, I am a professor after all. You're going to have a bit of a pop quiz, okay? It's not going to be graded, I promise, but let's take a look at what I'm talking about here, and you'll see, I think, why I'm doing this. So if you can take a few moments, which of the following on this list here of 10 things is a contemplative practice? We all may land in different places with regard to any given thing on this list. I think it's likely that certain things, most of us would agree, are likely to be contemplative practices, whereas other things, such as maybe playing a violent video game or browsing social media, are less likely to be so. But it's a bit of a trick question. Maybe you have that feeling as well, in the sense that maybe perhaps any of these could be potentially a contemplative practice if we had the right mindset or orientation to them. So this brings us quite centrally into the key question tonight, right? Or the core problem, that there's not really an agreed upon definition of what makes something a contemplative practice compared to other kinds of personal growth or self-care activities. So is there really a distinction? Is there something that makes contemplative practices unique when compared to something like what we call self-care? Is there an additional layer of intentionality or a different purpose behind such activities? Or can we kind of lump them all together and it doesn't matter so much? They're all kind of good for our well-being in various ways. And so what we call a contemplative practice maybe doesn't matter so much. Well, I'm going to argue, of course, this evening that it does matter. It does matter what we consider to be a contemplative practice and that there is distinct value to contemplative practices. To make this a bit more personal, this is going to be something, again, we circle around to later in the talk, especially when I share with you my new approach for thinking about what a contemplative practice is. And so, again, if you have a notebook out or pen and paper or some way of making notes, I encourage you to write 3 things down now. The first is something that is an existing contemplative practice for you, or if you don't have one, that's okay. But what's something that you clearly think definitely fits the criteria of a contemplative practice? The second thing I'll ask you to write down is another activity that you do personally that you think might be a contemplative practice, but perhaps it's not commonly recognized as one, or it's maybe very unique to you. So taking a moment to think about that. And last but not least, this one's the fun one. What's something that you do that you think is clearly not a contemplative practice? Okay, so something maybe you do kind of regularly that you know for sure that's not a contemplative practice. All right. I know I didn't give you a ton of time. Some of you may need a little more time to explore this. That's okay. You can keep doing so. Like I said, we're going to return back to these toward the latter end of the talk. And so if you'd like, you can keep thinking about them for now. But I'd like to pivot now and move into the next section, which has to do with why this matters. Why do I think it matters what the definition or having a definition of a contemplative practice is? Isn't this just an intellectual exercise, Jordan? Maybe this matters for people who are researchers and scientists. There's plenty of things that we can't define. Why does this matter? Well, I agree. There's lots of things that we maybe don't have an agreed upon definition for. But when it comes to contemplative practice, I do think it really matters for a variety of reasons, only some of which I'll talk about this evening. And I don't think it's just an academic exercise. I think it matters for us personally as contemplative practitioners or people who are interested in this topic. I think it matters for the mindfulness movement more broadly and the health of it as it moves forward. And I think especially it matters in terms of thinking about maximizing the potential of contemplative practice and contemplative transformation for our society and for humanity. So I'll give a few examples of why I think it matters here. The first has to do with the potential ways that not having such a definition could limit the scope of people and practices and perspectives that are represented in the mindfulness movement or the contemplative movement. This is a cover of Time magazine back in 2014, and it's been critiqued by some, by many, in fact, for its portrayal of mindfulness, sort of including who mindfulness is for or what mindfulness is about. And I think we need to be honest with ourselves as contemplative educators and researchers or just contemplative practitioners, that the particular things that we're drawn to that maybe brought us onto the path, that made us interested in topics like mindfulness and compassion and so on, may not be as appealing to everyone, everywhere, all the time, right? Especially in modern life. And so I think if we get clearer on what a contemplative practice is, that actually has the potential of opening us up to a wider variety of people, practices, and perspectives, which may be a little bit counterintuitive. But when we don't have such a clear definition, then it partly becomes a question of who gets to decide what a contemplative practice is, right? So we rely on authority for that understanding. And of course, different people are going to have different preferences and different things that they might prefer with regard to their own contemplative development. And that may not be what resonates with other people. And as an example of this, I think we have to think about the different spiritual traditions that have most strongly informed this mindfulness movement. And of course, the one that's most centrally informed it, and for good reason. There's lots of synergy between Buddhism and, for example, scientific approaches that have been part of the mainstreaming of things like mindfulness meditation. But there have been some in my field that have argued that it's not truly mindfulness if you don't meditate. And the implication there is that you should be doing some kind of Buddhist meditation, or that you must do Buddhist meditation to experience mindfulness as it truly is. Fortunately, there are people sort of gently disrupting, and not so maybe gently disrupting this understanding. And there are many examples. This is just one of them. I love this chapter, though. It's in the book Beyond White Mindfulness. And it's about students at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, integrating the practice of aloha, this native Hawaiian practice of aloha, into their mindfulness course and training. All right, so this concern, this problem with regard to not having a clear definition of what a contemplative practice is, has mostly to do with the breadth of contemplative practice, or the breadth of the mindfulness movement. But equally concerning is the way that not having a definition or not having a clear understanding of this also potentially limits the depth and effectiveness of mindfulness training and contemplative training more broadly. So you may be wondering, why does he have a McDonald's symbol here? Well, this has been sometimes referred to as Mick mindfulness, in the sense of a kind of fast food version of mindfulness, where we've maybe reduced the mindfulness to some sort of quick and easy approach. Of course, we have it on apps and things like that now. But what is lost in the mindfulness movement when we kind of make it as easy and frictionless as possible, right? So for me, that concern is tied centrally to our understanding of what a mindfulness practice is and what a contemplative practice is. If we have clearer understanding of what a contemplative practice is supposed to do and what it's really about, then we can lean into those aspects and identify those practices that are maybe better for most people, at accomplishing these things. But definitely we can become more aware of whether a given practice or approach is, accomplishing those aims for ourselves personally. The clearest example I've seen for this is not actually Mick mindfulness. It's this mindful mayo, which I think you can still find on the shelf. And as far as I know, I think the thing that makes it mindful is that it doesn't have eggs in it, right? So when we don't have a clear definition of contemplative or mindfulness, then it's going to get misused in different ways. You see this with Zen a lot too. And there are very good, I think, uses of this and well-intentioned ones. And of course, it can be a kind of skillful means. For example, I know a number of people who have gotten into meditation because they read a book called Zen Golf, right? They were golfers and they read a book called Zen Golf. However, I think calling mayonnaise mindful is a great example of maybe when it goes a bit too far, and it's probably not doing much service to the mindfulness movement more broadly. So you see headlines maybe like this. These are just some I've gathered over the years, critiquing, in this case, mindfulness, although this could apply to contemplative practice more broadly as well. Has the science of mindfulness lost its mind? Does mindfulness mean anything? The muddied meaning of mindfulness. mindfulness, and this is my favorite here, the saddest trend of 2015. Is it really though? And lastly, I think there are more legitimate critiques, such as this one from colleagues and researchers who study this stuff. Mind the Hype, a critical evaluation and prescriptive agenda, concerned that the hype around mindfulness may get ahead of the actual evidence. So I think there is a seed of wisdom in these critiques. However, I want to say something, which is that I think that because of this lack of definition, this lack of clarity, it's become kind of popular to bash mindfulness. And you may have noticed this, or maybe even within yourself sometimes, you kind of criticize mindfulness or contemplative practices or the movement, kind of throw the good stuff out with the bathwater. And so I think this is a real problem. And yet the seed of wisdom in it has to do with the fact that we need to get clear on this stuff. We need more clarity. And one way of thinking about that is if we don't really know what contemplative practices are for, then we don't really know where we're aiming. And it's a bit like trying to hit a bullseye in a dark forest or something like that. We're going to be less likely to hit the target. Whereas conversely, if we know clearly what makes contemplative practices unique and why we might want to do them, then we know what we call in research sort of the active ingredients of these practices. And we can potentially lean into them even more, pay attention to when they're present, find those practices that uniquely resonate with us personally and help us cultivate those distinct qualities. So speaking of hitting the mark, there's two more things that I would like to highlight here, is I think direct outgrowths of our lack of clarity of what a contemplative practice is. This one might be surprising. There's something called the sniper problem in contemplative science. So this comes up actually in a number of papers. And here's a quote from Mathieu Ricard, sometimes called the world's happiest man. He's a monastic. And there's this real problem of if we don't have clarity about what mindfulness is, and we talk about it in this very secular sort of way without an ethical framework and so on, that then the activities of even a sniper may qualify as a mindfulness practice. Okay, so he writes, I'll read it out loud because I think it's quite provocative. A clear example might be that of a sniper waiting for his victim. He can be one-pointedly concentrated, abiding unwaveringly in the present moment, calm and poised. The sniper is able to maintain his attention over time and bring it back to his target as soon as it wanders. To succeed in his ominous goal, he has to ward off distraction and laxity, the two major obstacles to attention. So then this naturally raises the question, is this a mindfulness practice, what the sniper is doing? And that's been explored and addressed in different ways within the field. And I think you'll see that the solution I offer this evening offers a unique way of relating to the sniper problem. It doesn't totally eliminate it, and we're not going to spend too much time on this problem this evening, but I think you'll see that the approach I take to defining a contemplative practice helps a little bit with the sniper problem. All right, and the last thing that I'd like to talk about with regard to this issue is so-called meditation-related adverse effects or difficulties. So there's a growing line of research that's quite provocative and needed on potential downsides of meditating maybe too much or meditating in ways that are not necessarily aligned with one's own well-being, or perhaps even meditating, and these are just kind of natural consequences sometimes at some point along the path of contemplative development. But there seem to be both person level factors here and practice level factors of people having adverse experiences with contemplative practice. So for example, childhood adversity may predict this, as well as meditating a lot. So if somebody's meditating quite a number of hours, that seems to increase the likelihood of having one of these meditation-related adverse effects. So for me, this highlights the need for people to be empowered to make decisions about what practices are genuinely supporting them with regard to the specific goals of what a contemplative practice is supposed to accomplish. So we need clarity then about what a contemplative practice is, so we can have discernment of whether a given approach that we're taking is actually, fulfilling the aims that we've been told that it should by people, who are sharing these practices, or that we've read about, or maybe, we're not doing it maybe with the needed support or something like that, and we need to go talk to a teacher or another expert or get additional kinds of support so that these practices continue to be supportive for us personally. So each of these problems in their own way kind of sets up a different or a kind of tension that I consider to be a false dichotomy. And it has to do with this tension of, if we define a contemplative practice in a sort of conservative way or traditional way, then we're narrowing the scope of contemplative practices. So if we kind of try and maintain the rigor of what a contemplative practice is, and we stick to those practices that are time-tested and that we know for sure, are contemplative practices, then this limits the scope. On the other hand, there's this interest in broadening our understanding of what a contemplative practice is in a way to make the scope of them more inclusive, to include more people, perspectives, and so on. But does that potentially water down the meaning of what a contemplative practice is? And it becomes kind of an anything goes mentality, or there's a false equivalency of, someone's skateboarding practice or someone's, whatever it is that they want to say is a contemplative practice, being sort of equally effective as these time-tested approaches. So in fact, I think that this is a false dilemma. I think this is a false dichotomy. And the approach that I'll take this evening, my goal is to kind of try and instead find a synergy. That once we get clearer about what a contemplative practice is, it actually broadens the scope naturally of what can qualify as a contemplative practice. And additionally, it invites more things in from the fold of our life to become part of our contemplative development and part of our own contemplative path and practice. So I'll put it this way: the ideal solution to this problem of not knowing what a contemplative practice is would be an approach that's easy to understand and that simultaneously fosters greater clarity, that it promotes more effectiveness of contemplative training, and it broadens the scope so that more people can experience the benefits of contemplative training. So in order to get there, in order to get to that ideal approach, I now want to talk about the four main approaches that are existing out there that have informed my approach that I'll share with you soon. And you might think about, as we proceed, those three things I asked you to write down earlier. What's something that you do that is clearly a contemplative practice? What's something that you think may be? And what's something that is clearly not? And look at it through the lens of these different approaches and see how you land there. And then when I present my new approach later, you can do that again. And as we get going, I want to say this very clearly at the outset, that no model is going to be perfect, right? The approach that I share later is definitely not going to be perfect. It's not going to fit. There's going to be exceptions, for some people sometimes. But hopefully the approach that we're headed toward is less wrong and more useful, right? So that's the goal this evening. And so in order to get there, we're going to take a look at the value of these different approaches, first of all. And if we wanted to say this in a Buddhist way, we would say, this quote from Thich Nhat Hanh, I think, speaks to it: clinging to views can prevent us from arriving at a deeper, more profound understanding of reality. So we don't want to get too much caught up in a view and not relate properly to our experience. And in fact, that's very central to this first, the gem of this first approach that I'd like to talk about, which is a historical approach. There have been some who have said, in order to, yes, we don't know what mindfulness is, yes, we don't understand what contemplative practice is, why don't we just go back to Buddhism, since that's the kind of the origin of this word mindfulness? Why don't we just go back there and look at something like a historical text like the Pali Canon, and that should tell us for sure what mindfulness is, right? But in fact, when myself and colleagues have done similar approaches in the past, we find that there's a diversity of definitions, even within Buddhism. And in fact, the Buddhists kind of have disagreement about what mindfulness is. And of course, this depends partly on the lineage that they're part of, but people favor different definitions or different approaches, right? Depending on kind of where they're situated or what tradition they identify with in this way. And maybe, there is some themes that cut through all of them. I think there are, but still, there's this diversity, and it's not necessarily the clearest path, in my opinion, to arriving at consensus. And it also becomes limiting in a way, because now we're just referring to a single lineage or a single spiritual tradition again. So what do I think the value or the gem is in this approach? Well, there are many, of course, and I think the nuance and the depth of contemplative training that we find in spiritual traditions is very important to preserve in the movement moving forward. But the key gem that I want to highlight has to do with something that I've noticed again and again in my career as a contemplative researcher, which is that anytime that someone's trying to explain mindfulness or explain contemplative practice to another researcher or scientist who themselves has never tried it, they only get so far. It becomes very confusing to the contemplative scientists or researchers. So when we're just staying at the level of concept or view, it's very difficult to understand something like mindfulness. We have to experience it ourselves. And for that reason, my approach to contemplative practice that I'll be sharing is very much about that. It's about personal exploration and finding what's a contemplative practice for each individual uniquely. All right, the second approach that's strongly informed my own is the lens of neuroscience. People get excited about neuroscience, and I think rightly so. But sometimes that excitement kind of outpaces its sensitivity or its ability to necessarily provide clarity on something. There's been lots of good research on mindfulness meditation, especially, but other kinds of contemplative practice from a neuroscientific approach. And these approaches have identified certain key brain networks. So from a brain-based perspective, we could say something like a contemplative practice is a practice that, impacts certain brain networks that we know are really important to core contemplative practices like mindfulness meditation. For example, the default mode network, or the salience network, or the central executive network. And I think that this is a great approach. There's lots of value in this, but it's not very practical for us personally. We can't exactly scan our brains every time that we're going to sit down and do a contemplative practice. So what do I think is the unique added value of a neuroscientific approach with regard to answering this question, though? Well, of course, I think we should continue to study contemplative practices using neuroscientific approaches for a variety of reasons. But one of the key things that I think comes out of this perspective is this view of contemplative practices being very unique in their potential for cultivating neuroplasticity, or for promoting what we sometimes call self-directed or self-guided neuroplasticity. So there's a bit of a myth out there that every experience we have changes our brain. Well, that might be true a little bit. It's a little bit like footprints in the sand, hence this image up here, where a lot of our experiences just kind of get washed away over time. And it's rare for a given experience to change our brains in a sort of deep way and to make an imprint that lasts. But it appears that contemplative practices may be sort of uniquely structured in ways that help us to promote neuroplasticity over time, in ways that we can self-guide, that we can choose certain kinds of development. We can choose based on the values of who we want to be and what we would like to, who we'd like to become in the future. We can do a kind of values-driven approach to cultivating our brain over time and leading to self-directed neuroplastic changes. And it turns out there's another sort of insight here, that when we look at the brain networks that are implicated in contemplative practices, we find some themes. And those themes highlight that contemplative practice appears kind of uniquely invested in a certain kind of neuroplasticity. And this is sometimes referred to as task general neuroplasticity. What I mean by this can be highlighted by this example here. This is one of the first studies on neuroplasticity in humans, showing structural changes in London taxi cab drivers after 6 months on the job of navigating the streets of London. And you can see changes in their brain, structural changes in the areas of the hippocampus that have to do with spatial navigation. But what the researchers showed is quite interesting, that even though they had structural changes in their hippocampus, And that has to do with spatial navigation. That only really supported those taxi cab drivers in driving the streets of London. It didn't really help them in other ways in their life. And it didn't even really transfer to other similar tasks that have to do with spatial awareness or spatial navigation. So this is what we call task-specific neuroplasticity. It's neuroplasticity that maybe is more incidental. It's driven by our environment or the challenges that we're uniquely facing. And it helps us with a certain set of tasks or one task or something like that. But it doesn't really generalize beyond that. And contemplative practices appear uniquely interested in what we call task general learning, which is a focus on these kind of brain structures or cognitive processes that appear to matter across our whole life, really. So myself and a colleague, Dr. Peter Grossenbacher here at Naropa, we did a review article focused on this question, and we found these 3 cognitive processes were uniquely impacted by contemplative training: intended attention, attention to intention, and awareness. So basically, attention, intention, and awareness. And you'd be hard-pressed to find something that you care about, something goal-directed that you do in daily life that doesn't centrally rely on the harmonious functioning of attention, intention, and awareness. So if we train these processes, if we get better at paying attention, at intention, and at awareness, there's potential for supporting us across our whole life, supporting us across a wide variety of goal-directed activities. And so this appears to be a unique feature of contemplative practices as well. And the final approach that I'd like to talk about this evening is sometimes called a family resemblance approach. This is more of a bottom-up approach to contemplative practice, defining contemplative practice. And the analogy that is sometimes used is that of sports. So sports is kind of a loose category. It's similar in the way that we kind of roughly know what we're talking about when we use the term sports, but there is a fuzzy boundary there. And there are some things that some people might call a sport that others don't necessarily agree with. And so similarly, could we approach contemplative practices in this way? Could we define contemplative practices in a similar way as sports? And a prominent approach that takes this, or a prominent example that takes this approach, you've likely seen before if you're part of this, if you hang around contemplative spaces much. This is called the Tree of Contemplative Practices. I'll let you take a moment to look at that. And it came about from a research study, kind of bottom-up research study of what different people considered to be their contemplative practices. And then from that, there were certain themes that were highlighted as maybe common to all of these contemplative practices, things like communion and connection and awareness. What I love about the Tree of Contemplative Practices is the way that it broadens the scope. It invites more people in. And remember, that was a key part of the challenge, I think, of what's needed moving forward for the field. So I love that it does that, and it invites in a wider variety of practices. But for me as a researcher, it's difficult to get empirical tractability with these terms here. They're a bit too broad for me. So it's an approach that kind of maybe went in the other direction of let's widen the scope, but then we maybe don't have as much precision as we maybe do from a cognitive science perspective or a neuroscience perspective and so on. So what we're aiming for, what I'm aiming for, is something more in the middle. But the gem of this, of course, is the need for person-practice fit. As Dr. Richie Davidson, one of the foremost experts on contemplative neuroscience, says, the best form of meditation is the one that you actually do, right? So part of growing this movement, having more people participate in it, is this wider variety of practices that are available and that fit within that scope. So people have more choice and more autonomy, and they can find those practices that really fit for them personally. All right, so we've talked about these different approaches now. Here are these different lessons from each of them. The historical, that we need to experience it for ourselves, neuroscience, the potential for self-guided neuroplasticity from these practices, cognitive science, that we want to focus on these processes or qualities of mind that are task general, that help us across a wide variety of aspects of our life. And then finally, we want it to be inclusive. We want the scope of contemplative practice to be broad enough to enable kind of this person practice fit and maybe even for ourselves to have a wide variety of possible ways of training the mind. So now I'm going to go into the new approach. Again, this is the very first time I'm sharing this evening, so I'll be interested in you in the feedback from you all, and there'll be an opportunity for that, and of course Q&A as well. All right. So this evening, I'd like to introduce you to what I call the tricolor model of contemplative practices. So this isn't the full model here. I'll share that with you in a little bit. But the purpose of the tricolor model is twofold. It's intended to both clarify what a contemplative practice is in terms of its boundary conditions, as well as broaden the scope of what qualifies. And it turns out that this kind of happens naturally, that when you clarify what a contemplative practice is, at least using this approach, it simultaneously broadens the scope of contemplative practices as well, and it invites more things in from the fold of our life that can become part of our contemplative training path. And so I really appreciate that aspect of this. And it's been personally, I'll name that it's been personally transformative as I've worked on this model. In contrast to the other approaches we talked about, historical, neuroscience-based, cognitive science, and family resemblance, how would I characterize this approach? This approach it's also evidence-based, so it comes from a review of the literature that I've been doing, but it's primarily an outcome-based model. So it has to do with what are the effects that contemplative practices are aiming for? What are the aims of contemplative practice? And can we actually see evidence within ourselves for those effects? And so by taking that approach, I think that we have the potential to kind of cut through some of the confusion that may come about from other perspectives or maybe kind of limited views on what a contemplative practice is. By the way, the tricolor model also borrows the metaphor from the RGB color model, in which you have different colors of light. You might have seen this model before, different colors of light that can be added together, sort of summed together at their different frequencies to create other colors. And their full sum, or their union here, is in the middle as white light or full spectrum light. So we'll be talking about all of these different zones of the model here soon. But the key thing is going to be these three qualities. So each of these circles here is going to represent a distinct quality. A couple of them I think will be quite familiar to you. And then the third one that I'll share with you that's really, I think, important for understanding what a contemplative practice is probably going to be fairly new. You maybe haven't seen this before talked about in the context of what a contemplative practice is. So the tricolor model can be used in many different ways. We're just going to talk about some of them this evening, and I'm going to again invite you into exploring this on your own. And so again, in order to do that, I invite you to take back out that list of practices. What's something that you do that you think is clearly a contemplative practice? What's something that you think may be a contemplative practice for you personally, but it isn't commonly recognized as one or traditionally recognized as one? And then finally, that fun one, what do you do that's just definitely not a contemplative practice from your perspective? Okay, so we'll go through the different qualities, and we'll reach a point each time, and I'll tell you when I'm going to ask you some questions to reflect on all three of these activities that you specified here. So let's start in with the first quality of this model here. And I term this quality presence to encompass not only mindfulness, but also embodiment. Okay, so I think that's really important. And so that being said, mindfulness is really central to this presence aspect. It's probably not too surprising to you all. And of course, there's a whole other version of this talk that I could offer where we talk through the sort of formal scientific definition of these things, and I present evidence and so on. This evening, I decided to keep it more applied and experiential, and so I just have quotes for each of them. So of course, we have Jon Kabat-Zinn, who first introduced mindfulness-based stress reduction and mindfulness to the West in a more scientific setting or medical setting. And I also wanted to share a quote about embodiment, since I think that is really important for this presence aspect as well. This is Kate Johnson. I'm struggling to remember the title of her recent book, but she wrote a new book that you could check out if you look her up about mindfulness and mindfulness of the body. So for me, this presence aspect, really important. And it's equally important that we don't just stay in the head with it, which I think that mindfulness has a potential to be more of a head thing for some people. And that's okay. We want to develop things like sensory awareness and sensory presence and so on, a cognitive presence, but also the body is already present, right? It's already in the here and now. And so embodiment is a very important component of presence. All right, moving to the second. Oh no, now for the questions. Okay, so I have one more slide, I guess, first, which is a few different kinds of practice that I have as representative examples of this category. Now, are these contemplative practices for everyone? No, that's going to be a unique thing for the tricolor model. That for some people, for example, mindfulness meditation may not be a contemplative practice for them. And the reason for that is it may not be producing the benefits of these three qualities and their harmony that I'll be talking about. And there are clear examples of this in the literature, things like people having trauma or different kinds of adversity, where something like mindfulness meditation may be a little too intense, at least the outset of one's contemplative path. Maybe it is something eventually that people want to turn to, but it's not maybe the right starting point for them. So these are just some examples. But now for you, with regard to the three activities that you specified, I want to invite you to reflect on these questions here. So for each of the activities in turn, the one you think is clearly a contemplative practice, does this activity foster greater presence in your daily life? Okay, so the focus of the tricolor model is also on long-term benefit. It's on fostering these qualities within our daily life, not the impact of any one particular session of a given activity. So I think that's very important to name. We're focused on lasting improvements in these qualities. And then with the second activity that you specified, does that activity foster greater presence in your daily life? Can you describe any lasting improvements in presence from that activity? And then lastly, that thing that you felt was clearly not a contemplative practice, does that activity foster greater presence in your daily life? It's okay if it does. As you'll see, we need all three of these qualities to be present in order to qualify as a contemplative practice. So it could be that it promotes presence, but not the other things. All right, so hopefully you're following along. This is making good sense to you and you're finding some opportunity for personal reflection. We can return to these questions and we will do so for each quality. So I'll move forward here. The next component is again going to be something probably quite familiar to you, but I do want to talk about a couple myths that are associated with it. The second aspect is compassion. And so here, my sort of simple definition of compassion is the kind of awareness of suffering and capacities needed to alleviate suffering, or that are aimed at alleviating suffering. And this includes both within ourselves and for others. And what I want to highlight here in this quote, suffering is the fuel of compassion, not its result. That sometimes people feel that they're too compassionate. But as we talk about in our mindful compassion training program, that again, we're starting next week, next Tuesday, I'm one of the part of the teaching team for that. Oftentimes when people feel that way, what they're really talking about is that they have too much empathy, or that they experience too much empathy as more of a subconscious experience. And that it's not actually turned fully into compassion in a way that's transforming that suffering as compassion typically does. So that's one aspect of compassion that adds some nuance. And then the other that I want to highlight here is evident in this quote from a participant in one of my research studies that I did with a colleague here at Naropa, Clarissa Segrand. And they say, I think the only way you can have self-compassion, is in a vacuum. Can you ever say that you're only taking care of yourself for yourself? So another unique aspect, perhaps, of how I'm thinking about compassion here is that it has to do with our own and other suffering, and that we can't really disentangle those two. So a contemplative practice shouldn't just be something that's about our suffering. It should also be something that over time is fostering those qualities and that awareness that is making us more awake to the suffering of others and more resourced and able to actually alleviate that suffering when we encounter it. So as we get into the questions, I want to highlight that sometimes the influence on these qualities can be indirect. This is especially so with compassion. So something like mindfulness meditation, for example, may not directly cultivate compassion, and that's okay. It may have an indirect influence on increasing our awareness of our own and other suffering in daily life, and that might be how it promotes compassion. And here's some practices that are typically done to cultivate compassion. And now for those questions with regard to the activities you specified. Does the activity you have in mind foster greater self-compassion and compassion for others in your daily life? Again, maybe not directly during the activity, but does it support your compassion in daily life? And are you able to describe any lasting improvements in your compassion from this activity? So then again, going through the other activities that you specified, the one that you think may be a contemplative practice, asking these questions about that. And the one you think is clearly not a contemplative practice, does that cultivate compassion? All right. Now for that last quality that I said may be more unique, that you may not have encountered before. Clear seeing. Okay, so what I'm calling clear seeing, we can define it simply as perceiving in less biased and more truthful ways. Okay, so I like this quote. This is an excellent book, by the way. You can actually download it for free. It's open source. It was just published by Thomas Metzinger. And he writes here something that he discovered in his own research on contemplative practices, a conclusion that he came to. Contemplative practice cannot be reduced to some banal form of self-help. It critically depends on the sincere intention of being honest towards oneself. Okay, so I think without this clear seeing aspect, without this goal or orientation of perceiving in less biased and more truthful ways, these activities that we may engage in are not contemplative practices, right? So we need all three of these qualities from the perspective of the tricolor model of contemplative practice. And of course, this is a huge range. Clear seeing is a huge range, ranging from just simple things like sensory clarity all the way to sort of interpersonal biases like racism and things like that, perceiving in less biased ways toward others, all the way to more existential truths, perhaps about reality and what is actually real, right, in our experience. So I have a couple quotes about that. One has to do with the potential for just broadly something like mindfulness to promote clear seeing. By decreasing reliance on past associations and memory, mindfulness is thought to free people to choose actions more thoughtfully and with less bias from those past associations. This comes from a research paper focused on interpersonal bias and the potential for mindfulness to reduce that. And I thought it was a nice way of thinking about why something like mindfulness may promote clear seeing. So in the field to date, I think this aspect has been underemphasized. We focused on mindfulness primarily as kind of a presence practice, as about being in the present moment or being more in our bodies. And we've kind of missed the clear seeing aspect. And even in traditional understanding and in Buddhism, this is emphasized. For example, in Buddhism, there's something called sampanjana, which is a kind of clear comprehension of our experience and of the context of our experience. So clear seeing, I think, is essential. And then here's a participant in Thomas Metzinger's book talked about sort of the more existential aspect of clear seeing, a direct, real experience without filter, the real thing, just like waking up to real life, as if everything else I know is just a dream, an illusion, right? So you see this emphasized, lots of language around this in contemplative traditions around the potential of awakening, the potential of seeing more clearly, seeing our experience, seeing what life is really about more clearly. And for me, that's an essential aspect of what a contemplative practice is. So we've now got our three qualities. I now want to talk about kind of the interplay of them and the essential importance of what I call here this central overlap rule is what I'm going to call it. The central area of overlap has to do with the way that these processes kind of balance each other or offer different counterbalances for each other, and the necessity of all three to fully qualify as a contemplative practice. So we now have example practices for each of the three qualities by emphasis, but all of these practices should, in a way, involve all three components if they are contemplative practices for us personally. And here are some that are maybe uniquely positioned to promote clear seeing. And so you can see here that this broadens our understanding. Even something like critical thinking can be a form of contemplative practice, so long as it's also supporting our presence and our compassion. All right, and so now asking some questions about those activities you specified. Does the activity foster perceiving yourself, others, and the world more clearly and truthfully with less bias? And are you able to describe any lasting improvements in your clear seeing from this activity? And then going through your second practice and that third activity that you think is definitely not a contemplative practice. All right, and there's a little more nuance here for fully determining whether something is a contemplative practice or not through this lens, through the tricolor approach. But first, let me show you here these areas of overlap between the qualities. We can highlight other practices that maybe fall in these different color zones. So another utility, and we'll talk about this, of the tricolor model is kind of identifying a set of contemplative practices that we may have and seeing maybe, where we're emphasizing in our own practice, maybe one quality primarily, and we maybe need to lean into some of the others, or perhaps we need to work more on the interplay of these different aspects. And then, as I talked about, there's this central overlap rule that's going to be really the next layer of nuance here. So here's a couple of quotes that I think speak to the central overlap rule, and they have to do with the interdependence of these qualities. So this one comes from Judy Leaf, who's a former president of Naropa University. It is hard to be generous, disciplined, or patient if we are not fully present. If we are present and attentive and our mind is flexible, we are more receptive to the environment around us. Okay, so I think this speaks to the overlap of presence and compassion to some extent. Here's another one, Eckhart Tolle, spiritual teacher. To experience anything fully and see it clearly, there must be a moment of presence. Here he's talking about this zone here, the overlap of presence and clear seeing. Okay, and I didn't include quotes, but we could find similar things to talk about in this zone here, as well as in the central zone. So the central overlap rule has to do with that ideally, a given contemplative practice should be sort of strongly or clearly fostering all three of these qualities, and not just fostering them independently, but also supporting their interplay or their harmony. But at a minimum, the central overlap rule says that it's not a contemplative practice if it's diminishing any one of the qualities. So we could return to our sniper example. Sniper example may fit well in this zone here where it's promoting presence. The sniper has to be very present and they have to be perceiving quite clearly in terms of sensory clarity, at least. However, are they in touch with their compassion? Can they actually honestly say that that activity that they're doing is supporting or cultivating their compassion? I think perhaps in some rare instances that may be the case. And again, we're not going to get into the complexity of the ethics of that this evening. But I think it more clearly, this approach kind of screens out these other things that maybe are on the fringes of what could qualify as a contemplative practice. And so it's one utility of the tricolor model. All right, so based on this now, I'd love to hear from you in the chat. When you went through the different activities that I asked, the one that's supposed to be clearly a contemplative practice, the one you think maybe and the last one that you think is definitely not a contemplative practice, what did you end up with? And you can answer very simply of, from the lens of the tricolor model, yes, no, and unsure, or something like that. So you could just put a yes, yes, no, or something like that. If you're willing to share in the chat now, the 3 activities that you specified. Great. And later on during the Q&A, we might actually hear from some of you about specific examples. That's sometimes fun. What are people doing that is a contemplative practice that maybe we didn't think about ourselves? Wow. Thank you all for sharing. It appears so far that you're at least able to use this model to evaluate these activities. Again, there are going to be exceptions, and I encourage you to work with this on your own and kind of play with it a little bit and explore it. And again, refer to the kind of idea that there could be an indirect influence from some of these activities on cultivating these qualities in daily life. So you're the ultimate authority on that with regard to this approach and perspective. I like that last comment there from Mark about sometimes. So sometimes a practice may be supportive of these qualities, and at other times it may not be. So that is another layer of the tricolor model, another nuance of this approach that I think is kind of unique, that sometimes something is a contemplative practice and sometimes it's not for us. And it maybe is, when we're using a contemplative practice in a kind of self-aggressive way or something like that, or what we're calling a contemplative practice, and then it's not necessarily supporting the qualities. So this for me is a kind of like flame that I can hold up a given practice session to and ask myself, do I believe this practice session is truly fostering these qualities in a long-term kind of way? Of course, we're not looking at the results from any one practice session as our evidence for that. We're focused on lasting improvements. So thanks all for sharing with that. And I want to say a few more things, and I want to share with you this model as a free resource that you can download. So I'm getting to that. We're almost there. I already addressed this, but you can use this model to think about the emphasis in your own contemplative development. Is there one of these qualities that you kind of favor over the others? For example, it's probably no surprise to you all that on my path for a long time, I was really focused on that clear seeing aspect as a researcher and scientist. And it took me some time, and I love getting into the compassion science literature, which really woke me up to the need for cultivating compassion more intentionally in my life. I also want to highlight the potential for practice innovation. So I think when we get clearer about what a contemplative practice is supposed to do and cultivate, there's less risk of going astray. So I didn't address this earlier, but one of the problems when we don't have clarity about what a contemplative practice is that people kind of just make stuff up, and it's not necessarily supporting them in the ways that they maybe hope that it would, or that a contemplative practice is aiming for more broadly. But I think that when we have clarity about what an activity is supposed to cultivate within ourselves, then we're less likely to go astray with practice innovation. All right, the last one that I want to share, last application I want to share with you this evening, and then we're going to talk about the free resource and next steps with this, is the potential for this transforming our life as a whole. The potential for the tricolor model not only to evaluate practices, but to evaluate moments, to evaluate activities and experiences. We may ask ourselves in any given moment, is this moment supporting these 3 qualities? Is it fostering these 3 qualities? Now, should every moment, all the time, be fostering all of these qualities? I don't know. That's up to each of us to decide, probably on a personal level. I can say very clearly that if we happen to discover that it's not, we shouldn't then beat ourselves up over that, or get angry with ourselves or upset or something like that. It shouldn't become another should. But in a more intentional way, there may be an opportunity to live a more contemplative life through taking this approach. All right. Now, finally, I want to talk about next steps, and then we'll get into the Q&A portion. So here at Naropa, we have this saying, transform yourself, transform the world. So if you resonate with this perspective this evening, I invite you first and foremost to continue exploring it yourself. And I'm going to share with you in a moment a free resource that you can use so you have access to the questions that we went over this evening and the rules of the tricolor model, and you can begin to explore this or continue to explore this personally. And perhaps you decide that you want to take this with you. You want to carry this forward and become somewhat of an advocate of this more inclusive and, I think, clearer approach to what a contemplative practice is. And so the next thing I want to share with you all is where you can download this tricolor model. So I'm making this freely available for both commercial and non-commercial purposes, that you could use the tricolor model in a clinical setting, in an organizational setting, in a business setting, maybe as a consultant. It's free to use in this way. And in fact, if you go to this website, you'll even find a version of it where I have blanks, so you can fill in the blank with your own practices that maybe fit into the different colors and figure out maybe an area where you're still needing a practice or two. And you'll recognize the questions that we talked about this evening here in the lower left-hand corner. I have a clear definition of what a contemplative practice is here in the upper right, and it talks about that central overlap rule, the long-term focus, that this should ideally broaden our understanding of what a contemplative practice is. And I'll just note that I am working on a more scientific paper that presents the tricolor model as a framework for contemplative phenomena more broadly. So if you'd like to stay updated, I'm going to share more resources over time. You can also get on my email list, which is very low frequency emails for updates about the tricolor model at this website, which is jordanquaglia.com/tricolor model. All right, and then I also want to invite you to attend future Café contemplative events. Hopefully you found value in this presentation this evening. I'm just the first. I'm just kicking it off. We're going to have more events like this. As I said, they're going to be fairly spaced out over the coming even years maybe, but all on this theme of mindfulness is for everyone. We have an exciting lineup, and we're going to get more speakers, I think, not only from within Naropa, faculty and staff within Naropa, but also outside Naropa, who are maybe experts on this topic of mindfulness is for everyone. So please stay tuned for that. And again, I have here at the bottom the link. If you, for some reason, couldn't see that at the top of the screen, I know it's hidden in my view. So here's the website where you can download the tricolor model and the different versions of it and begin using it yourself. So all that said, I welcome your questions at this point. I think there's a Q&A function. And so let me click on that and see if that gives me what's needed here. Okay, so one of the first ones I'll address here, and so feel free to submit a question, by the way, in the Q&A function. And I also am noticing that in the chat, maybe there are, so if you could put it in the Q&A function, that will help. Thank you all. Thanks for saying that. I'm glad it may have been helpful. Okay, so what are some examples of the meditation-related adverse effects? That's one of the questions. Yeah, that's a great question. I encourage you to actually go and read some of the literature on this. You could look up meditation-related adverse effects, use that keyword, and you'll probably find some interesting articles about that. There's a wide the reason I say that is there's a wide variety of potential adverse effects that have been found. And so if I say a few of them, I could, like difficulties paying attention, might be concentration difficulties or different kinds of sensory experiences that are undesirable, or different kind of somatic activation, different things like that. But that's not fully representative of the list. There's lots of different possibilities of things that people are reporting as undesirable effects of their meditation practice. Of course, there's debate within the literature of how much of that is just, stuff maybe that's coming up for healing or transformation, or potentially, that it was pre-existing and people are just noticing it more because they're paying more attention. But it does seem to be that there's something there, that for some people, some of the time, they are experiencing some adverse effects, especially on more intensive bouts of meditation. Let me see this one. It looks like making some art was in the presence and clear seeing. Art can also be personal, subjective. Yeah, so where I located any given practice on the model was just as for example purposes, right? It could fall into any of the other categories for you personally, or maybe for you personally, it's not even a contemplative practice. So don't maybe take my examples to be, too literally there. I just put them where I thought they might fit and provide nice examples for maybe most people. And I did, of course, explore this with others. It wasn't just me deciding myself. I have a research team, and over years now, I've actually asked people using the tricolor model for examples. Allison asks, what would you describe as a spontaneous practice? Well, washing dishes is sometimes a good example of an opportunity for spontaneous presence practice, maybe emphasizing presence. Hand washing dishes or something like that. Basically, from a contemplative path perspective and from the perspective of the tricolor model, anything has the potential to become a contemplative practice if we shift our mindset towards fostering these qualities in the present moment. So even something as simple as walking, we might be out on a hike or something like that. We can transform that into more of a contemplative practice by paying more attention to the present moment, by being more in our bodies, by focusing on things like sensory clarity or reflection, self-reflection in ways that help us see ourselves and others more clearly, and so on. Can you explain what you mean by more truth or seeing more truthfully? Yeah, I see everyone's truth as being equally valued. It's a very important question. And I think that each person, that's one of the approaches of the tricolor model is each person reflecting on this and what truth means for them personally. So I think that's resonant with the perspective you're asking here. Of course, I think that we can, and from a scientific angle, use the tricolor model to study how people may become less biased over time using standardized assessment tools that actually sort of more objectively get at biased ways of perceiving or different cognitive biases like a self-serving bias and so on. Do you believe that there is a certain quality in your model our society most needs in this current time to move toward a more contemplative world? Well, thank you for this question. I'm not sure I'm authority to speak to that. Personally, I think all three qualities, and my opinion maybe is more about the field of contemplative science more specifically, that I think the field of contemplative science more specifically needs to emphasize more a study of clear seeing. That aspect, I think, needs more attention. Another question is, if it's hard to find an activity that enhances all three aspects, can different activities enhance one or two? Yes, definitely. Again, the central overlap rule is that at least it shouldn't, at a minimum, diminish the other quality, right? But you may find that, okay, it's not strongly fostering all three qualities. That's okay. That's why I group them by emphasis, because a lot of times practices are going to emphasize or specialize in one of the qualities over the others. The tricolor model does not, from my perspective, describe a spiritually based contemplative practice that is focused on greater self, Buddha nature, God, etc. Is my perception incorrect? Well, I wouldn't say that your perception's outright incorrect in the sense that I'm not explicitly taking a spiritual orientation toward this model. However, I did design the model to be open to multiple worldviews and perspectives, including a spiritual one, which I take quite personally as valuable in my own practice and approach to contemplative awareness. So I'd say that where that fits most strongly is in the clear seeing aspect. So if you think that, greater self and Buddha nature and God and so on are resonant terms for you, and that moving closer to that is moving closer toward truth, then that fits very well in the clear seeing aspect. But of course, I also think that it has to do with presence. For example, the presence of God is something that's talked about is an outcome of the practice of centering prayer. So overall, I hope that you find that this can be valuable from a spiritual perspective as well. Someone wants to use better measures of mindfulness. Do you have thoughts on how this model can be leveraged to develop updated measures of mindfulness? I do have thoughts about that. Again, I think there's a whole different version of this talk that has to do with sort of the scientific or research aspects of it. So I won't go too much into that this evening, But I would love to see, measures that get at things like sampanjana from a traditional perspective, clear comprehension, and maybe, fold that into conceptualizations of mindfulness. For myself, I think it's okay if mindfulness kind of stays focused on that present moment awareness, and then we just also emphasize these other aspects of compassion and clear seeing. How does this model address a person's intention and motivation? An activity can promote presence, compassion, and clarity, but if not engaged with proper intent to cultivate awareness, is it a contemplative practice? Thank you for this question. It's a wonderful question. Many approaches that are out there to defining what a contemplative practice is have focused on the importance of intention, including some approaches that I've taken, such as in the cognitive science perspective, a paper that I worked on with a colleague here at Naropa really emphasizes intention strongly. I think there's something really important there about intention. However, this is an outcome-based approach, and I've decided to focus on that instead of focusing on the particular mechanisms that may underlie achievement of that outcome. One may argue that intention is needed to cultivate these qualities. That may be true, but an outcome-based approach has an additional strength, which is flexibility of the path that someone may take to get there. So potentially someone, in order to cultivate greater presence, compassion, and clarity, may not take a path that, is involving intention in such a central way as we think about it in our practice. And so for me, that's very important to focus on the outcomes instead of the particular route or path that someone might take to get there, and then narrowing our definition of contemplative practice to only those particular routes. I think it's better to keep it broad and open from a means perspective and to focus more on the outcomes, and that's why I took this approach. How effective is embodiment if the body is suffering? Wonderful question. And this really speaks, I think, to the importance of that overlap between presence, embodiment, presence, and compassion. When we can learn to be with our suffering in our bodies, not only from a present moment or present awareness perspective, but also to hold it within a container of loving support that we feel resourced from, and that offers us a kind of buffer an opportunity for transforming some of that suffering, then a contemplative practice and paying attention to our suffering and something like embodiment of suffering becomes something not just, that we're paying attention to what's maybe bad in our experience, but it becomes something that's potentially going to help promote healing over time. I am an orchidist and consider pruning my fruit trees as a contemplative practice, as I have compassion for the tree as I am being present with how my pruning practice will shape. Thank you for that example. That's wonderful. Yes, I love hearing the unique examples of what people find to be contemplative practices for them. And the tricolor model, I think, encourages and invites that reflection. And I hope you find that even more things fit that for you. Would my presence criteria be considered a mindfulness criteria? Yes, it would be. I would say that my presence aspect includes both mindfulness and what some people here, like Naropa Christine Caldwell, call bodyfulness. So mindful embodiment as well. But mindfulness is definitely a key aspect of that. So I've reached the end of my list of this section. I'm going to take a look at the chat. Thank you, Allison. I'm glad that it was valuable. Let me take a look at the time. Oh yeah, we're nearing the end of our time here. Thank you. So someone's wondering about dissociation here. So there is another question in the chat, dissociation. So I actually think there's less risk of practices promoting things like dissociation using this approach. If people are empowered to make decisions about practices, and they're doing so on the basis of how it's supporting the cultivation or fostering these qualities in daily life, then if they discover that something like mindfulness meditation or yoga or any number of other contemplative practices are making them feel more dissociated, right, contributing to those symptoms, then they have more opportunity to discern whether that's going to be a supportive contemplative practice for them or not. And so this speaks to the importance of what's sometimes called trauma-informed approaches to mindfulness training or contemplative training. And I think that the tricolor model is very much trauma-integrated. It has the potential of addressing some of these issues. Yeah, so someone says that they are finding it difficult to be more mindful as a mother, and that they're working toward attaining mindful states even while sweeping, cleaning, and other challenges. Thank you so much for sharing your experience about that. And it is really my hope that the tricolor model broadens our understanding of contemplative practices in ways that make them much more flexible and adaptable for our life situations. You know, someone as a new mother, such as yourself, hopefully can find these as invitations, these sweeping, cleaning, and other challenging duties that you maybe are having to do on a daily basis can be transformed from just something that you're having to do as a chore to something that is also supporting the fostering of these qualities over time. Of course, I realize that it may not happen perfectly every time, you know, that kind of thing. And that's part of the practice. That's part of what we're working with in our life. So thank you. All right. Let's see if there's any more questions in the actual formal question. What do you think that setting the intention to practice presence, compassion, and clear seeing as an approach to life? I think what you're asking here is, do I think that there's an importance of setting that intention? I think so, you know, although we want to find terms that resonate with us personally. And it may be that the terms that I relied on this evening aren't those for you. So when you're setting an intention, thinking about how you connect with these qualities and what makes most sense to you. And of course, you don't need to limit your contemplative practice to only these three qualities. You may also want to cultivate things, you know, more specific things like creativity, or your imaginary faculties, or yeah, any number of other things. I've made an argument to colleagues that dance is a contemplative practice. Yes, absolutely. I think dance is definitely a contemplative practice. So thank you for that question. Although I would say that it's probably not a contemplative practice for everyone all the time, right? We could dance in ways that are distracted. We could dance in ways that are maybe self-aggressive, you know, if we're focused too much on choreography or things like that. So I think for the most part, what you're outlining here is that dance can be a contemplative practice for you personally. And I think for many, they find dance to be a contemplative practice a lot of the time. All right. Uh-oh. I seem to have lost the screen, and I don't know if you all are still there and can see me. If you are there, I don't know why my screen just went black. I guess it's time to close out. Thank you all so much for your time and for attending the talk this evening. And I'm glad to hear that many of you found it valuable. I welcome any feedback. Feel free to be in touch. If you can't hear me, then I'm just talking to an empty screen right now. And so it goes sometimes in the Zoom world. But thank you all again. I'm holding you in my heart and in my practice this evening. So thanks.